Here's a normal plane landing, and here's the Concorde landing. Which one are you looking at? That's not even a fair question. A normal jet glides in flat, nose level, gear down, and it settles. Gently, almost boringly. The Concorde came in like it was daring the runway to stop it. Nose pitched up at a 10-degree angle, that enormous delta wing clawing at the air, the whole aircraft balanced on the edge of what physics would allow. Passengers in the cabin couldn't see anything out the windows except sky. The pilots couldn't see the runway, and somehow, every time, it worked. That's what made the Concorde unforgettable on landing. Not just the speed it had been flying moments before. What made the Concorde unforgettable was the landing itself. The controlled drama of a machine that had bent the rules of aviation so far it required an entirely different set of techniques just to get back on the ground. Landing a normal jet is, in the broad sense, a solved problem. There are procedures, there are checklists, there is a comfortable margin for error. Landing the Concorde was something else entirely, and understanding why tells you everything about what it actually costs to go supersonic, not in dollars, not in fuel, but in sheer aerodynamic sacrifice. Let's start with the wing. Every design decision on the Concorde was a downstream consequence of one fundamental requirement: it had to fly at Mach 2, twice the speed of sound, more than 1,300 miles per hour. At those speeds, a conventional wing, the kind you see on a 747, swept back at an angle with a gentle curve, would generate so much drag the plane would never sustain cruise. So engineers went in a completely different direction. They gave the Concorde an ogival delta wing. Delta because of the triangular shape, like the Greek letter. Ogival because of the slight S-curve along its leading edge. The delta wing was extraordinary at high speed. It cut through the air with minimal drag and gave the aircraft the structural strength to handle the aerodynamic heating that came with cruising at twice the speed of sound. The airframe itself would stretch by about 10 inches during flight from the thermal expansion. The windows were hot to the touch. The paint was twice as reflective as a normal jet, not for aesthetics, but because it had to radiate heat just to keep the aluminum from warping. Everything about the Concorde was calibrated to that one brutal requirement: survive Mach 2. But the delta wing made one enormous trade-off. At low speeds, the speeds you need for landing, it was almost completely useless in the way a conventional wing generates lift. A normal wing works by creating a pressure difference between its upper and lower surfaces as air flows over its curved shape. That lift builds smoothly as the aircraft descends. The Concorde's delta wing, at low speed, didn't work that way. Instead, it relied on something called vortex lift. As the aircraft pitched its nose up steeply, the sharp leading edge of the delta wing would cause the airflow to break away and curl into powerful spinning vortices along the top of the wing. Those vortices created a dramatic low-pressure zone, and that low pressure generated lift. It was aerodynamic judo, using the separation of airflow rather than its attachment to keep the aircraft in the air. But it required a very high angle of attack to make it work, about 10 to 11 degrees on final approach, maybe more during the actual touchdown. On a normal jet, the angle of attack during landing is more like 5 degrees. The nose comes up just slightly. Pilots can see the runway clearly. They can adjust. They have time. They have margin. On the Concorde, at 10 degrees nose up, the runway disappeared completely from the pilot's field of view. Below the cockpit windows, nothing but the horizon and the glide slope needle on the instruments. Engineers had to solve this, and the solution was the droop snoot. The nose of the Concorde could be mechanically lowered. At full droop, 12.5 degrees down during landing, the pilots could finally see the runway below the tilted fuselage. Without it, the approach was essentially instrument-only until very late in the descent, which, at the speeds the Concorde was flying, was not a margin anyone wanted to compress further. Because the approach speeds were not slow, not even close. A normal Boeing 737 on final approach comes in at around 130 to 140 knots. A 747, heavier and larger, maybe 145 to 155. The Concorde landed at around 160 to 190 knots depending on fuel weight. At the beginning of a transatlantic flight, fully loaded with fuel, the Concorde was heavier than it would be on arrival. But the fuel burn at Mach 2 was staggering. 4 Olympus 593 engines drinking roughly 5,600 gallons per hour combined. And by the time the Concorde crossed the Atlantic, it had burned off enormous fuel weight, so landing weights varied significantly, and so did approach speeds. But even at its lightest, it was fast, consistently faster than virtually anything else in the commercial fleet. And that speed was a consequence of the same wing that made supersonic cruise possible. The delta wing, with its enormous surface area but unusual lift generation, required higher speeds to produce the vortex lift needed to keep the aircraft from stalling. Slow it down too much, let the angle of attack get too extreme, and the vortices collapsed. The wing stopped flying. That was the Concorde's hard floor, and it was higher than most jets ever approached in cruise, let alone landing. So pilots were managing a high angle of attack, an obstructed forward view even with the droop snoot extended, approach speeds at the top end of anything in commercial aviation, and a wing that was doing something physically different from what most pilots had ever trained for. The result was an approach that looked and felt nothing like anything else. Passengers who watched landings from the ground described it as almost disturbing. The Concorde came in steep compared to a normal jet, nose up, engines at full power. That's the other thing. On the Concorde, you didn't reduce thrust on final approach the way you would on a 737. You kept significant power on because the aircraft needed it. The delta wing, generating vortex lift, was doing so at the cost of enormous induced drag. Without the engine power, the aircraft would sink faster than the approach profile could tolerate. Power was part of the landing technique, not just a precaution. The transition from the approach to the actual touchdown was its own separate challenge. On a conventional aircraft, the flare is a gentle maneuver. As the runway approaches, the pilot eases back on the controls, raising the nose slightly to arrest the descent rate and bleed off the final few knots of speed. The main gear touches down, the nose follows smoothly, and the aircraft settles. There is a comfortable amount of time to make that judgment. The Concorde, at 160+ knots over the threshold, compressed that time significantly. The flare technique was different from any normal jet. The aircraft was already at a high pitch angle just to fly, so the additional rotation in the flare was subtle, just a small pitch increase above the approach attitude. Too much rotation and the tail could strike the runway. The tail clearance on the Concorde during landing was not generous. There were tail skid sensors precisely because this was a real risk, not a theoretical one. Too little flare and the aircraft would hit the runway at a significant descent rate without the cushion of the speed bleed-off. The Concorde didn't bounce the way the MD-11 did, for different structural reasons, but a hard landing on the Concorde was hard on the structure and hard on passengers. And then there was the thrust reversal. On a normal jet, once the main gear is down, the pilot deploys thrust reversers and brakes, bleeding speed. The Concorde had thrust reversers, but the Olympus engines that powered it were afterburning turbojets, a fundamentally different architecture from the high-bypass turbofan engines on modern airliners. Thrust reversal on the Concorde was less effective per pound of engine thrust than on a modern wide body. The aircraft carried air brakes on the wing surface to help, and the tires absorbed significant deceleration load, which is part of why the tire failure on Air France, Flight 4590 in 2000 was so catastrophic. Those tires were doing serious work at high speed. The landing rollout was also longer than a normal jet of the Concorde's size. The aircraft needed the runway. London Heathrow and JFK were its primary ports, partly because of range and partly because those runways could handle it. Pilots who flew the Concorde consistently said the same thing. It required anticipation rather than reaction. A normal jet, if you got slightly out of position on the approach, had enough aerodynamic margin that a correction was relatively straightforward. The Concorde operated closer to its limits. At 11 degrees nose up and 175 knots, the gap between flying and not flying was smaller. Inputs had to be planned ahead, not improvised in the moment. You were not reacting to what the aircraft was doing. You were anticipating what it was about to do. The pilots who flew it regularly, the British Airways and Air France crews who flew the transatlantic route again and again, described a deep respect for the aircraft's demands that became almost mechanical. They knew the numbers. They knew the feel. They had flown it enough times that the steep pitch attitude, the loud engine roar on final, the narrow flare window, the fast rollout, it all became normal, or at least their version of normal. By the time the aircraft was on final approach, the people on board had just crossed the Atlantic at twice the speed of sound. They had watched a Mach meter tick up through 1.0 while the cabin applauded. They had eaten a full French meal, finished a glass of champagne, and looked out the window at the deep purple of the sky above 60,000 feet. The whole flight lasted 3.5 hours. The landing had to close that experience. It had to be right, because the people on that plane had paid upward of $12,000 for the ticket, and they expected perfection. British Airways and Air France positioned a spare Concorde in New York just in case a flight had mechanical problems, an airplane sitting on the ground making no money, purely as insurance against disappointing passengers who had paid $12,000. Because those passengers expected to walk onto a Concorde. That was the atmosphere the pilots landed into every single time, not just the aerodynamic challenge, but the expectation. And they delivered. In 27 years of commercial service across tens of thousands of landings, the Concorde's landing safety record, separate from the 2000 crash, which was a tire failure on takeoff, not a landing accident, was essentially unblemished. That's not luck. That's what happens when you train specialized crews to fly a genuinely difficult aircraft over and over until the difficult thing becomes second nature. It stopped in 2003. The planes went to museums, and the sky above the Atlantic went back to being crossed at 35,000 feet in 7 hours in something flat and quiet and comfortable, and nobody looks up anymore.